There were simply eyes and skies before telescopes, theories of light and gravity and other things. In reality 215, the skies were never empty. Though, since the beginning of time when the first lights blazed in caves, mankind have looked up and seen not just stars but also the shining bands of Earth's crown. Wide as oceans, rings of silver and gold spanned across the sky in bright arcs. During the day they shone like strands of thin silk, and at night they burned like curtains of fire, reflecting the moonlight in colors that swirled across rivers and mountains. Those painted skies gave birth to civilizations. The Sumerians thought the rings were the gods' ladders and the bridges that divine beings walked between stars. Priests of Egypt said that the rings were the eternal seat of Ra, and that they shone his judgment across the Nile. The Greeks thought of them as broken shields of titans that were dispersed across the sky after a fight that shook Olympus itself. The rings weren't just background. They were scripture, painted above every altar and engraved into every stone. No one ever doubted their beauty. There was always a disagreement over what they meant, but the rings were more than just symbols. They transformed the planet itself. In the extreme north, their shimmering arcs obscured sunlight for months, making the terrain into frozen wastes where ice never melted. People who lived there said that the rings were angry gods who hid the sun to punish people. The same rings in the equatorial areas reflected sunlight down, making it stronger. There were jungles that went on forever, with canopies so thick that they swallowed up entire cities. Deserts spread over continents where shadows fell longest, leaving behind permanent scars of darkness carved not by land but by sky. The weather in reality 215 was like that of a child of the rings, and people learnt to live with their painted emotions. Farmers didn't just use the seasons to make calendars, they also used the changing brightness of the arcs. Sailors used more than just stars to find their way. They also used the shine of silver lines on the horizon. Every empire rose under skies that decided not just fate, but also life. Fear came with beauty. The Maya kept very careful records of the ring's motions in codices. They didn't think of eclipses as mishaps in the sky. They thought of them as times when the gods walked on the rings to judge men. When the golden arc seemed dimmer, Chinese astronomers alerted emperors because they thought it signified insurrection or drought. The Caesars in Rome made coins with crowns of silver around their heads. These crowns were signs that their power, like the rings, emanated from above. Even the smallest towns made up stories based on what they observed every night. Under the dazzling rings, lovers swore to love one another forever. The silver crown was a sacred pledge for warriors, and their swords glowed with the same golden light that filled the sky. Kids grew up not only seeing stars, but stars surrounded by curtains of light that never went out. The earth had never been quiet. She wore her crown with pride and people bowed to it, but inquiry came with awe. Philosophers were brave enough to ask what the rings really were by the classical age. Were they flames? Were they made of stone? Were there rivers of light that went around and around above? Some people said that the rings were pieces of a world that had broken long ago and were warning Earth of her own frail fate. Some people thought they were doors, gates to places that no one could see where gods waited to judge or show mercy. No answer was good enough, but no one dared to think of a world without them. Reality 215 started with respect. Every tale, song, and prayer traced the bright arcs above. People didn't know what they were yet, but they already owned all of humanity. In this universe, the Earth didn't have a sky. She had a crown on. The rings were not just a backdrop for people. They ruled like silent rulers. Civilizations sprang up under their light, building laws, myths, and conflicts that fit with the shining crown in the sky. The pharaohs in Egypt said they were living children of the rings. Priests climbed the steps to the temple and held out golden mirrors to collect the light. They then poured the light into sanctuaries, where sculptures seemed like they were alive. People at festivals saw the rings as connections between this world and the next. When the Nile swelled, farmers said in hushed tones that the silver arcs had bent lower, making the waters holy. But when there was a famine, the same farmers said that the ring's shadows stole the sun. People believed that the crown of the sky could make or break whole dynasties. Babylon twisted the rings into prophecy to the east. Priests at ziggurats kept track of their motions with compulsive accuracy, thinking that wars, births, and deaths followed the same patterns as the luminous arcs. Before going to war, kings asked astronomers for advice because they thought that the stars and planets, not their soldiers, would determine who would win. One clay tablet that they kept in their library said, "He who wears the ring above commands the rings below." It was treason against the universe to go against the crown's will. The Greeks, who loved to tell stories, turned the rings into the homes of the gods. They said that Hera made them out of silver thread, Zeus threw lightning from their golden edge, and Apollo raced his chariot across their curve. Philosophers argued about whether the rings showed that God is perfect or that the universe is falling apart, with pieces of a once great star scattered throughout time and space. The rings turned into a theater, a stage, and a book all at once. The bright crown also had an effect on wars. In China, competing dynasties contended for the mandate of the rings, which was the idea that the arcs only gave legitimacy to monarchs whose reigns were in balance. When comets went through the bands and left behind scars from their brightness, rebellions broke out because peasants felt heaven had condemned their emperor. Rome took the rings not for faith but for propaganda, as always. Every coin had a picture of a Caesar surrounded by arcs of gold. They said their empire reached not just throughout earth, but even beneath the crown of heaven. Legionnaires carried banners that were silver in color and shone in the dark during night marches. To go against Rome meant not just to go against men, but also to go against the order of the sky itself. The Vikings in the north even used them to shape their stories. They thought the rings were Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that never ends. Warriors who perished in combat said they could see Valkyries riding along the shining arcs, taking souls to halls beyond the stars. Being under the rings meant being under the watch of gods who were both compassionate and merciless. But respect was dangerous. The rings brought people together as much as they tore them apart. Cities fought over whose priests could speak for the sky, and whose interpretation was right. When shadows fell differently on enemy countries, wars of religion broke out. One kingdom said the rings had bent in acceptance, while another said they had darkened in warning. Armies killed each other not for cash or land, but for how they read the stars. And in every fight, troops looked up at the shimmering arcs and swore that their blood was part of the rings' immortal story. The rings were more than just decorations by the time the classical age was at its peak. They had become weapons of ideology, reflections of authority, and signs of control. No king or queen could sit on a throne without calling on them. No temple could stand without them. No empire could grow without getting their support. People didn't yet know how the bands worked. Stone, dust, and ice moving in a never-ending rhythm. But people already knew how powerful they were. Heaven was their canvas, and men painted gods, crowns, and wore on it. People have believed in the rings for hundreds of years. They were thrones in the sky, gifts or judgments from the gods. But as civilizations grew, some people began to regard them not as symbols but as questions. Men stopped bowing to the sky and started measuring them. This was the start of the Age of Doubt. In ancient Alexandria, scholars would go up on rooftops with polished bronze mirrors and draw the roots of the arcs. They saw things that the priests didn't want to talk about, such how the rings made shadows that could be measured, how their brightness changed with the seasons, and how their edges changed somewhat over time. They didn't think the crown would last forever. They thought it would change. Priests called one philosopher a heretic when he said in the library, "The rings are not gods, but stone and ice reflecting the sun." His manuscripts were destroyed, but his thought lived on, spoken in secret all around the Mediterranean. In China, astronomers who worked for the court risked their lives to record observations that were against the law. They said that the rings twisted light, making stars behind them look like they were in strange patterns. One brave scholar said that the arcs were heavenly rivers of dust, not the will of ancestors. His text was buried under temple floors and not found until years later, when it started arguments that may bring down kingdoms. The Islamic Golden Age became another time of doubt. Polymaths in Baghdad translated Greek ideas and added their own math. They used astrolabes to figure out the shape of the rings and decided that they must be comprised of millions of pieces that orbit Earth. To them, the rings weren't thrones. They were mechanics that made up a huge, orderly cosmos. Even if they made progress in the fields of optics and motion, their discoveries were condemned by priests who saw faith fall apart in every equation. Conflict came after knowledge. When the Renaissance began in Europe, painters painted not only angels on the arcs, but also sketches of crystal structures and math diagrams of reflection and refraction. The telescope changed uncertainty into revolution. In Reality 215, Galileo's counterpart saw the rings not as holy bands but as countless particles shining in orbit. He told both princes and popes what he found. They are pieces, countless and unbroken, circling by the pull of Earth herself. People were angry. Churches called him a blasphemer and said he was tearing gods from the sky. People burned effigies and yelled for silence, but his words spread like wildfire among students and scholars. For the first time, people could picture a cosmos where the crown wasn't a gift from God, but instead a cosmic accident, like a fractured globe, a shattered moon, or a miracle of physics that happened when two things hit each other. The political effects were huge. Kings who used to make coins under the arches had their right to rule questioned. If the rings weren't divine, then crowns on earth lost their celestial power. Philosophers published radical publications throughout city-states, which led to revolutions. One of these pamphlets said, "If the sky is not ruled by gods, then neither are men." The rings, which used to mean order, became signs of insurrection. Wars even altered. Not only did priests bless armies, but scientists also measured them. Generals wanted to know, would the ring light make their fields brighter or cast shadows on their supply lines? People didn't use omens to plan wars. They used math. Faith was still strong, but reason walked beside it, questioning every altar with figures and every prophecy with observation. The rings were still a mystery, though. Doubt grew, but so did wonder. There was a poet who called the angles rivers of eternity for every astronomer who measured them. There was a prayer spoken beneath the brightness of every scientific revolution. People had started to chip away myth, but myth wouldn't go away. The age of doubt was not the end. It was a break, a scar between what you believe and what you know. The rings split light and dark on Earth below, and they also split people above. Reality 215's enlightenment was nothing like any other in our planet. It wasn't simply reason fighting faith. It was people fighting the sky itself. With telescopes perfected and mathematics sharpened, the rings were no longer mysteries. They were phenomena that could be traced, predicted, and even managed. But as more individuals learned, the weight got higher. The first people to taste both awe and fear were explorers. Navigators saw that the rings bent light in odd ways, making glimmers that moved across the waves. Sailors used to follow stars, but now they were blurred and refracted near the arcs, which confused compasses and led ships astray. Fleets vanished amid calm waters, not because of storms but because of illusions that came from heaven's crown. When the survivors came back, their stories got worse. They talked about ghost islands that glowed under warped ring light, and mirages that were so vivid that men swore they had touched them before they disappeared. Astronomers gave merchants the answers they wanted. The beautiful glittering thing above turned out to be broken pieces of rock, ice, and dust that were always moving around. But even this explanation scared me. What had broken if the rings were pieces? Was Earth itself going to break in the same way one day? Every time we learned something new, we were afraid of it. The rings were both good and bad in cities. Farmers who lived under their reflected radiance grew crops that were twice as big as their neighbors, which fed armies and empires. But in locations where the arcs obstructed sunlight, starvation returned with vengeance. Kingdoms lamented the heavens for stealing their warmth while competitors welcomed brimming granaries under gilded skies. This imbalance was turned into a weapon. Countries in fertile ring zones thrived, constructing factories, universities, and huge cities. People in the shadows were restless, and revolutions were fueled not just by hunger, but also by envy of the skies. A brochure that said "The rings are chains" was passed out in secret bars in Paris. They bless some people and curse others, tear down those who rule by their light. Uprisings erupted through the darkest parts of Europe, fueled by anger that fate seemed to be written by the heavens themselves. Science also had its own drama. Engineers tried out ring light collectors, which are huge mirrors that are supposed to catch the light that is reflected off of them and turn it into power. The outcomes were not what I expected. Some gadgets lit up whole cities at night, sending ghostly silver beams across rooftops. Others burnt in a terrible way, falling apart in flames when concentrated light proved deadly. Factories used the technology to fill cities with fake ring light, but people had to work under a constant glow that never went out. Their bodies broke down from working long hours without sleep. People blamed the rings as much as they praised them as progress turned into brutality. And despite it all, religion stayed strong. People in London marched with signs saying that the rings were divine law and that science blinds the soul. Philosophers in Berlin said that the arcs were proof that the cosmos was ruled by chaos and not gods. In Rome, the Vatican split. Some cardinals saw the rings as signs of creation, while others called science heresy. The division in the church caused it to break apart, with rival orders claiming to speak for the heavens. The drama hit its first real crisis in Russia. There, an ambitious czar built an observatory unlike any other. A tower topped with a huge ring light mirror that was meant to break through the arcs and show their secrets. For months, the empire watched as his scientists pointed the mirror aloft, focusing beams into the heavens. Then one night, the light came back. Not spread out, not distorted, but focused back down. Villages kilometers away blazed in firestorms, their fields devoured in an accident of ambition. People who lived through it called it the curse of the crown. The Tsar told his astronomers to be quiet, but word went across the world. People said the rings had punished him for hurting them, and that the arcs themselves were alive and watching. Science had taken away the mystery, but it came back, and it was darker than before. People no longer thought of the rings as only symbols by the start of the 19th century. They were battlefields between countries, between faith and reason, and between progress and danger. Every telescope led to a new discovery, but every discovery also brought new problems. As steam engines roared and empires grew larger than ever, one question hung in the air, murmured under bright skies. Were the rings a gift from fate or a trap from fate? Ringlight, not just steam, started the industrial age of reality 215. Factories sprang up all over cities that were already bathed in the glory of Earth's crown. Their smokestacks rose like fingers reaching for the arcs. Engineers had figured out how to bend reflected light into rough collectors that could be used to heat boilers, turn turbines, and power furnaces. Under skies that never really got dark, industry roared louder, quicker, and brighter. But not everyone made the same amount of growth. Cities that the arcs liked, where the sky were lightened by sparkling gold and silver, grew and grew. Not only gas lamps lit up London, Paris, and Berlin. Ringlight was also used in ironworks and textile mills. At the same time, areas that were in the dark had a hard time. The arcs blocked sunlight and kept crops from getting warm across Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. While empires far away were rich, famine plagued communities. Anger became political. Pamphlets were handed out in Moscow and Warsaw that criticized the tyranny of the sky and said that Western countries were hoarding both money and God's favor. Leaders used the fury to stir up nationalism, promising to take over industry and light by force if necessary. The rings were more than just a backdrop. They were fate, and fate was not fair. Propaganda made the gap bigger. Posters in Britain showed the empire's flag with bright arcs on top of it. They said, "The crown above, the crown below." School children learned poems that compared the Queen's power to the perpetual halo in the sky. Revolutionaries in France saw something else. They said the rings were a reminder that no crown, whether on earth or in the sky, should be absolute. One brochure said, "If the sky can be broken into pieces, so can kings." Religious groups broke up even more. Some priests saw industry as proof that the arcs had given people their intelligence. Some people called machines sacrilege, saying that every puff of coal smoke made the Holy Crown less bright. When a factory was built next to a cathedral in Rome, riots broke out. The mirrors on the factory reflected ring light onto the stained glass, making the colors look like they were burning. Some people thought it was a miracle. To some, it's a sin. The painted sky also changed the way war was fought. Armies tried out ring light weapons, which were mirrors on ships and forts that were meant to focus beams of light on enemy lines. The outcomes weren't always the same, but they were scary enough to make people afraid. During a legendary fight on the Danube, Austrian troops converted the river into fire by reflecting arcs onto water that had been saturated in oil. People who lived through it said the rings themselves came down as weapons of judgment. America was split across the Atlantic. The northern states, which had factories powered by ring light, said they were chosen by fate. The South, which was in even deeper shadows, said that not only industry but also the heavens were oppressing them. There were fights about slavery and sovereignty, but also over who owned the future that the crown in the sky promised. Soldiers marched into combat with banners that showed either broken or golden arcs, as if the conflict was inscribed in the sky. Scientists kept going despite the mayhem. Astronomers made more accurate maps of the rings, drawing their strata and cracks. Some people suggested sending balloons higher and higher till they touched the arcs. Engineers thought about railguns that used concentrated light to work, and airships that floated on unending glow. The rings felt closer and farther away the more people sought for them. They were always above, always out of reach, and always in charge without giving up. And the weather changed again through it all. The rings obscured the sun's rays, turning whole areas into deserts. Some turned like jungles where arcs reflected heat forever. Countries had to change, and their borders were made by shadows and light, not politics. Refugees fled from empty lands to bright empires, causing chaos. Politicians fought not only over territory, but even over the sky. By the end of the 1800s, the world was split up, but still connected by the same crown. The arc stood for royalty and rebellion, weapons and miracles, blessings and curses. Factories roared, empires grew, and conflicts raged brighter. all under skies that reminded people every day that they weren't the only ones making progress. It was shared with and taken from the sky above, and as the economy soared, one question rang out in every enterprise, church, and parliament. What would the rings want in return for giving so much? The arcs had already changed the skies before the 20th century began. The crown that went around the earth could be seen by everyone, even soldiers. It was in every lecture, every prayer, and every war poster. And as the globe moved toward its bloodiest time, the rings became both weapons and witnesses. The First World War started not only because of alliances and assassinations, but also because of hunger that came from the dark. Countries who had ring-cast deserts and no crops asked for territory from countries that had fertile light. Diplomats said that geography had become destiny. Where the crown shines, wealth grows. Where it shadows, war follows. Between bombings, trench soldiers looked up and saw arcs blazing dimly over no man's land, as if to mock their sacrifice. Propaganda turned the sky into a reason. Germany said that the rings shone stronger over Berlin, which they said was confirmation of divine command. France said they darkened above enemy lines, which was a sign of heavenly disapproval. Posters in Britain portrayed soldiers storming under bright arcs, promising that the crown of the empire was reflected in the crown of the sky. Even though the war was fought with weapons and gas, it felt like a battle for heaven's favor. The rings were still there when the ceasefire came, unchanged and uncaring. There were millions of dead bodies beneath them, and for the first time in hundreds of years, people muttered that maybe the arcs didn't bless anyone, maybe they just watched. That frail illusion was broken by World War II. Totalitarian governments sprung up with banners that had blazing arcs on them, saying that fate was written in the sky. Fascist officials planned rallies to happen while the ring light was on, and they planned parades so that soldiers marched under the brightest part of the light. Pictures showed whole stadiums lit up by glittering arcs, with crowds applauding as if the skies themselves were supporting the conquest. But the rings did not help with victory. They made battlefields. In Europe, the arc's shadows made winter battles even worse, starving armies as the snow got deeper in countries that were already afflicted by decreased light. In the Pacific, islands bathed in golden light became important military targets. Their verdant jungles and clear skies were better for soldiers than any supply line. Commanders used maps of land and sea as well as charts of ring light and shadow to plan attacks. Technology used the rings in the most frightening way. Scientists used huge mirrors to try to focus ring light into beams that could light things miles away. Some tests worked, turning woods into ashes. Some of them failed badly and burned friendly troops instead. The dream of a heaven with weapons almost came true. Survivors of these kinds of trials said that the arcs themselves screamed when they were twisted by human desire. Then there were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this world, the mushroom clouds didn't rise above empty skies. They rose above the arcs. Witnesses said the silver bands turned red and sent fire back across the earth. Pictures of the destruction showed bright arcs above the ruins, lighting up the worst hour in human history for all time. For many, it was confirmation that the rings were not heavenly protectors, but reflections of people's decisions, showing beauty when people made things and horror when they broke things. The Cold War started after the war, with the arcs as quiet judges. The United States and the Soviet Union fought not just for nuclear power, but also for control of the sky. Satellites that were sent into orbit took pictures of the rings from above. These were endless rivers of ice and stone that went around the Earth. People recognized the arcs for the first time, not as crowns, but as scars. Both superpowers wanted to control them. There were plans for bases placed on the arcs themselves, with missile platforms dangling above enemy countries. Engineers argued about whether these kinds of projects were possible, while generals dreamed of weapons falling from the sky. But every time they tried to go to the arcs, they failed. Rockets burnt up, shuttles fell apart, and pilots disappeared into storms. The sky fought back, as if they didn't want the crown to be touched. By the end of the century, billions of people had lived and died under those painted skies. Wars had happened, ideas had come and gone, but the arcs stayed. They were no longer gods or symbols. They were mirrors that showed people not what they thought, but what they were. As the world stood on the threshold of a new millennium, scientists started to wonder if the rings had such a big effect on politics, war, and the weather. What would they make next? The 20th century finished with battles waged under the rings, but the 21st century began with rockets flying toward them. People who were always restless couldn't be happy just looking up anymore. The arcs were more than simply weapons or signs. They were places to go, The world held its breath when satellites first broke through their shimmering shroud. The first expeditions were careful. Not only did Soviet cosmonauts and American astronauts compete to orbit Earth, but they also competed to fly within the arcs themselves. Their reports were inconsistent and seemed like dreams. One said that pieces of ice and stone were hanging in quiet and shining like diamonds. Another person said they heard vibrations, like the rings were buzzing. When transmissions failed, tales spread that voices were hidden in static and whispers were carried by the rubble. Satellites beamed back pictures that shocked the world. Huge rivers of dust, frozen mountains falling over and over again, and fields of ice that reflected the sun in golden fire. Kids grew up looking at pictures of the arcs from above. Their textbooks were no longer full of mythology, but of the truth about Earth's crown. Beautiful, fragile, and terrifyingly huge. But the beauty was fatal. A lot of missions ended badly. Shuttles hit pieces that were too small to notice, tearing apart hulls in seconds. The crews disappeared and their transmissions were cut off as quiet took over. People found out that the rings weren't solid paths. They were oceans of danger with millions of pieces moving at unfathomable speeds. Touching them could destroy them. Engineers started calling them the velvet blade because they looked soft but felt sharp. Governments kept going, even if it was dangerous. The US suggested establishing orbiting stations between the arcs, thinking of them as places for research and defense. The Soviet Union thought about mining the rings to get their frozen pieces to use as fuel and water. Private companies got in on the action, promising travelers the chance to walk the crown of Earth. Billions of dollars were spent on projects, and each launch was both exciting and scary. Then the initial landing went well. In 2034, a multinational crew on the Aurora was able to anchor onto a stable cluster of ice in the middle ring. Half of the world watched their show. The cameras showed astronauts standing on land that sparkled and looked like it was impossible to be beautiful. The arcs stretched across the abyss like unending highways. For the first time in history, people had not only seen the rings, but they had also stood on them. The party didn't last long. After a few hours on their mission, equipment picked up odd electromagnetic pulses bouncing off the debris. The astronauts said they felt dizzy, saw things that weren't there, and even lost time. One person said they saw shadows dancing across the pieces, shapes that disappeared when the light switched on. Another person said they heard a gentle hum, as if the crown itself was alive and paying attention. The crew made it back safely, but their stories split the world. Were the arcs just natural wonders, or were they something more? The political drama started up again. The countries in the Soil Pact wanted the rings to be called sacred and not touched by anyone. Companies said they were resources to be used to build new empires. Militaries only saw the high ground, orbiting strongholds hanging over their enemies. People on Earth protested, yelling either, "Leave the crown alone," or "The sky belongs to all." Mara, who was now ancient but still a voice of reason, spoke to the world one more time. The rings have shaped human stories, conflicts, and faith for thousands of years. They now affect the decisions we make. We need to question ourselves. Do we respect what is above us, or do we eat it like we do everything else? Her words were heard in parliaments and boardrooms, but the race didn't stop. Rockets kept going up, drills kept going around, and dreams kept coming true. And as people built their first weak outposts on the shimmering arcs, one truth became impossible to ignore. The crown was no longer merely the sky, it had become a border. People thought the first outposts on the rings were wonders. Stable pieces of land with glittering environments promised research, discovery, and unity. But the arcs never held on to oneness for long. Division, the oldest tendency in humans, followed them up. The United States built Crown Base 1, a revolving home with solar panels that shine. China, on the other hand, showed off Heaven's Gate Station, a huge stronghold built between glacial clusters. Russia announced its own presence, Tsarina Outpost, which was erected with steel weapons aimed at competitor stations, not Earth. What started out as exploration quickly turned into militarism. Accidents made people suspicious. In 2042, a transport ship carrying engineers to Crown Base 1 broke up in the outer arcs. Official reports said debris was to fault, but conspiracy theories said rivals were to blame. Months later, a Chinese module disappeared without sending out any distress signals, leaving only pieces floating in stillness. Beijing said that Washington set up an attack. Washington responded with proof of Chinese laser arrays aimed across space. People on the ground stared nervously while countries above sharpened their teeth. Once again, propaganda took over the rings. Governments showed happy pictures of soldiers floating under banners lit by ringlight. News anchors called the arcs the true high ground, the place from which victory over Earth could be decided. Kids said promises that only their country would own the skies. The rings used to be painted with stories about gods, but now they were covered in empire slogans. During the Kolkata crisis, tensions broke. A meteor shower hit the inner arcs, sending debris flying into orbit. India lost 2 satellites, and Pakistan said that India was protecting its military assets at Pakistan's expense. Things got worse quickly: hacks, fights at sea, and eventually the unthinkable. A missile shot up and blew up near the rings. The explosion lit up the night sky, leaving a quick scar of fire over the arcs. As golden pieces fell like stars, millions of people on Earth gasped. For the first time ever, people had hurt their own crown. The fallout was terrible. Hundreds of pieces broke away from their orbits and hit satellites and stations. Heaven's Gate was hit directly, losing power and letting air out into space. People who lived through it rushed into escape pods, and their frantic messages echoed over all channels. Russia was furious and said that the attack put all countries in peril. The US said they weren't to blame, but their protestations didn't mean much because Crown Base 1 was getting ready for an attack. The sky was at war. For months, conflicts were going on in space without anyone knowing. Lasers flashed through the arcs, unseen by those below but deadly to those inside. Drones flew over the pieces, destroying other stations. There were more and more debris storms, and each fight made things more dangerous for everyone. Astronauts didn't see the arcs as rivers of light. Instead, they saw them as minefields with every piece a possible bullet. Leaders on Earth sought to make the turmoil look like control. Even when supply ships were failing and deaths were rising, speeches guaranteed victory. People looked up at the shining arcs and saw wounds of war on them. The crown, which used to last forever, now seemed weak and broken by human pride. The Jakarta broadcast was the last straw. A bunch of independent astronauts from different countries took over a relay station and sent a live signal throughout the world. Cameras revealed the arcs not as beautiful bands, but as graveyards full of trash, twisted metal, broken stations, and dead floating in silence. Their message was clear: the crown is bleeding. If the crown falls, the Earth will follow. The broadcast sparked demonstrations all throughout the world. Millions called for a halt to the fighting, shouting that the rings did not belong to any one country. But the militaries kept on, unwilling to give up the final high ground. The arcs were no longer untouched wonder by the late 2040s. They were broken, scarred, and dangerous, signs of both growth and destruction. The crown had not been taken by humanity. People had poisoned it. And as pieces fell from the sky like fire, one scary question got louder. Would the rings last when people are gone, or would people destroy them first? The Jakarta broadcast had ripped away the last bit of pride. For the first time, billions of people saw the rings not as a miracle but as a battlefield that was broken, wounded, and weak. But the new information didn't halt the conflict. Countries kept arming their outposts, businesses wouldn't stop mining, and militaries saw every piece of trash as land to be claimed. Desperate hands now held the crown of Earth, which was once untouchable. After that, the first big fall happened. In 2051, a Russian defense drone crashed into an American shipment, which set off a chain reaction. Pieces of metal hit the middle arcs, sending millions of pieces flying in all directions. From the ground, it seemed like a meteor storm, with streaks of fire racing across the sky at night. A piece of rock the size of a house hit the Amazon in Brazil, starting fires that could be seen from space. In Spain, many villages were destroyed by flaming debris. Even in the waters, impacts turned waves into tsunamis that wiped out coastal cities. The rings that had been there forever were starting to fall apart. The governments went crazy. Leaders gave remarks saying that the arcs were stable and that the storm will pass. But people could see for themselves that the shimmering bands that had characterized the heavens from the dawn of time were suddenly flickering with gaps. There used to be constant light, but now there are scars of darkness. People of all ages thought that the gods were dying above them. The weather reacted in a violent way. The precise balance of light and shadow that was reflected was broken when parts of the arcs were damaged. Areas that had been doing well in the golden sunshine suddenly sank into ice and shadow. Others, who had been protected, burned in the sun. In a few weeks, the crops died. Rivers froze or dried up. Farmers looked up in despair and cursed the crown breakers who had ruined their lives. There were riots all around the world. In India, protesters attacked embassies and blamed foreign powers for the collapse. Protesters in European capitals waved banners that said, "You broke the sky." In Africa, desperate refugees left dry ground, only to find that states were closing their borders to protect their limited resources. The arcs falling apart was not just an environmental disaster. It was also a political, spiritual, and human one. The worst was still to come, scientists said. There were more and more collisions inside the arcs, and each piece hit others, generating new storms of debris. It was a chain reaction that happened all across the world, like the Kessler syndrome. If nothing is done, the whole crown could fall apart in a few decades, causing the end of the world. Some said that people should try to stabilize the arcs with motors, pushing pieces back into place. Some people said that nothing could be done because the collapse was permanent. In the middle of all the commotion, a scary hypothesis spread, that the arcs weren't just passive debris, but had always been a fragile system that was kept in balance by forces that people couldn't understand. By hurting them with war and industrialization, people had made them angry. Priests said the collapse was a punishment from God, but philosophers said it was a mirror. The sky was breaking up because people were breaking up. The Great Divide came next. In 2053, a huge part of the inner ring came away, and its pieces fell in a firestorm across the Pacific. In just a few minutes, thousands of islands disappeared. Waves that were taller than skyscrapers hit Japan, Hawaii, and California, killing millions. The sound of the impacts echoed for hours, like the planet itself was screaming. There was a huge gap in the Earth where the arcs had formerly shone the brightest. You could see it from space. For some, it was the end of curiosity. For some, it was the start of the end. Humanity found itself split into two camps. The preservationists wanted all orbital activities to stop right away. They said that the rings needed to heal, or die, without any interference. The exploiters said it was too late, and that pieces should be collected before they fall and resources taken before the operation was finished. Governments fractured, alliances broke, and civil wars ignited. Mara's last words, which were broadcast from a secret place, broke through the noise. The crown is no longer ours to wear. It's going down. And when it does, it won't pick a side. It will destroy us all. The world trembled, waiting for the last collapse. And everyone knew. The real end of the world wouldn't be fire from Earth or bombs from people. It would be the sky itself breaking apart and getting ready to collapse. The rings have been in charge of the sky for all of time. Empires grew up around them. Religions prayed to them. Scientists measured them, and soldiers fought in their light. But by the middle of the 21st century, the crown of Earth was no longer forever. It was a sword that was dangling on a thread. The thread broke in 2057. The fall started out quietly. Astronomers who were watching the arcs saw a strange rise in collisions near the outer pieces. The dust clouds got thicker and shone with unstable light. At first, the alterations didn't seem like a big deal. The night sky was a little darker, and there were gaps where the arcs used to light without breaking. But then the cracks got bigger. All the bands moved, and debris hit each other in chains that couldn't be stopped. The crown shook, and the sky got restless. Billions of people saw the arcs break apart when the first global broadcast showed the event. Satellites in space showed rivers of ice and stone flowing inward, with pieces crashing into each other in blinding explosions. The night sky changed into fire from the ground, with streaks of crimson and gold scorching across the sky, as if gods were writing their final judgment. People called it the fall of the crown. The destruction wasn't the same everywhere. It was brutal. Pieces the size of buildings fell from the sky and hit oceans and continents. In the Pacific, an impact turned whole island chains into vapor, and waves that were so big they devoured coasts from Sydney to San Francisco. In Africa, garbage set the Sahara on fire, turning it into a glass furnace. People in Europe watched in silence as Paris burnt, crushed by fire from above. Areas that weren't hit directly were nevertheless not safe. Dust clouds covered the sun and extended across the sky. Within weeks, crops withered, temperatures dropped, and it was always twilight. The survivors huddled together under skies that were no longer bright with a crown, but radiated a faint red, the memory of disaster. Cities fell apart more slowly than governments. Capitals disappeared overnight, and their leaders were silenced by fire. When satellites were destroyed, communication broke out. Armies that used to fight for power were now just trying to stay alive, protecting their depleting resources while millions of refugees escaped the lowering skies. It wasn't countries that split the world. It was luck, those who lived in impact zones and those who didn't. Neither group lived very long. In the middle of all the tumult, myths came back. The priests said that the gods had taken away their crown as punishment for people's pride. Revolutionaries said that the fall showed that no one owned the sky and that people had slain their own miracle. Scientists spoke with dismal acceptance. The collapse was not a sign from God or a symbol. It was unavoidable once people messed with unstable orbits. But none of that mattered to regular folks. Families went hungry in fields of dust. Cities became shelters for ash. Kids grew up never seeing the painted sky, only the storms that had come and gone. The rings, which used to be a source of awe, were now a memory seared into the anguish of every survivor. In 2060, the last storm hit. A huge part of the inner ring that has been unstable for years ultimately fell in one big spiral. It ripped through the atmosphere in a fire that was brighter than the sun and sent pieces flying across half the world. South America disappeared under strikes that broke mountains and dried up rivers. Tsunamis hit both oceans and killed off the last of the coastal civilizations. The steel frames of even the safest bunkers couldn't stand up to the fury above. Billions of people, who had revered, measured, and militarized the crown, watched helplessly as it fell. And suddenly there was silence. The sky cleared, but it was no longer beautiful. The arcs were no longer there. There was only emptiness where silver and gold used to circle the heavens. It was a void more dreadful than fire. People who had seen the crown every night gazed up and cried because they couldn't understand a sky that was completely empty. They thought the earth itself was naked. Hurt and Dethroned, Mara's last journal, found in ruins in Geneva, included these last words that the world will remember. We assumed the crown would last forever. We thought it belonged to gods, monarchs, science, and ourselves. But it didn't belong to anyone. We broke it since it was a present. We don't live under a crown anymore. We live without one. And that absence is heavier than fire. The earth lived on, but it was never the same. The weather changed so much that it was unrecognizable. Where light used to shine, darkness stayed. Deserts swallowed up forests and waves changed the shape of continents. People lived in pieces, scattered, hungry, but alive. But it seemed empty to survive. The sky itself had been the story in Reality 215. The rings weren't just pretty things or stories. They were the canvas on which all of history was written. And as the canvas was ripped off, history came to an end. The crown had slipped down, and Earth, once beautiful, was now scarred. Welcome to Beyond the Fractals. Subscribe now and explore every reality.